Buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a comenzar. François, we're going to say some words in Spanish to introduce the whole thing, and afterwards we'll switch to English again. Bueno, gracias a todos por estar aquí. Tenemos hoy nuestra última charla del ciclo Dual Practices, que es la edición de este año del ciclo anual del departamento de proyectos, como sabéis. Y tenemos un invitado que para nosotros cuatro es muy excepcional, ¿no? Porque es una persona que sabíamos que queríamos que estuviera en la escuela casi desde el momento en que empezamos a pensar en lo que íbamos a contar con este ciclo. Antes de presentarle, ¿no? y que entremos como en materia, y a modo un poco de clausura, bueno, pues queríamos un poco recapitular, ¿no? Lo que han sido estas, y ahora le damos la palabra a Silvia Colmenares, ¿no? Para que cierre el asunto como Dios manda. Pero bueno, la verdad es que ha sido estas 6 charlas que hemos armado que nos han permitido conocer cómo en 6 escuelas relevantes de nuestro entorno próximo se trabaja con esta doble condición, que es muy interesante, desde luego, para nosotros que somos profesores, pero repercute directamente en la mayoría de los que estáis aquí hoy, que sois los alumnos, ¿no? Y que tiene que ver con esta enseñanza particular de algunas escuelas y de algunos profesionales como los que hemos traído, que digamos que implica como la reflexión teórica y la investigación proyectual en la enseñanza del proyecto de arquitectura. Y esto es algo que yo creo que durante estas 6 charlas, primero con Eckert, ¿no? Desde Mendrisio, Luis Callejas desde Oslo, Humberto Napolitano, ¿no? Desde la EIA, luego Marcus Bader desde la UDK de Berlín, Franco Tagliabue desde Milán y hoy con François Charbonnet desde la ETH, nos ha permitido conocer aproximaciones diversas a este asunto tan importante. Yo creo que la otra cuestión que tenemos que hacer es dar las gracias a nuestro director, al director de departamento, al departamento, a Silvia Colmenares, la subdirectora de investigación. Bueno, yo creo que a Blanca, a Mercedes y a Nico Barrena, que no está por aquí, pero que ha sido de gran ayuda. Y bueno, yo creo que te paso a ti la palabra, Silvia, para que cierres un poco el asunto, ¿no? Antes de que...
En realidad el orden tendría que haber sido al revés, porque yo lo que tenía que deciros es que gracias a vosotros, porque, bueno, parece que son actos como puntuales, aislados, pero de verdad que hay mucho trabajo detrás y no es fácil convencer a la gente para que venga, para que viaje, para que dedique un día, 2 días, ¿no? en algo en lo que tiene una cierta continuidad. Entonces yo quería agradeceros todo el esfuerzo. Creo que el ciclo ha funcionado muy, muy bien y sobre todo quería recordaros que desde el departamento pensamos que que este no es solamente un programa de conferencias, sino que también es un programa de alguna forma de investigación, porque pretendemos que lo que sucede a lo largo del año tiene un hilo conductor que se concreta en una publicación que, como muchos sabréis ya, pero si no lo sabéis os lo digo, la del primer ciclo ya salió hace como un mes o mes y medio, está disponible para su compra en ediciones asimétricas online o aquí en la escuela y que inmediatamente nosotros hoy, que termina el ciclo, nos ponemos ya a producir el siguiente número, que espero que, bueno, estoy convencida de que va a ser de mucho interés y nada, que entendáis que esto no son solamente como una sucesión de conferencias, sino que tiene su cara como editorial. Y nada, daros las gracias.
Bueno, hacemos una breve presentación en inglés, ¿vale? We should switch to English for a second, so we can know some tips on François' work and trajectory. So, Charbonnet graduated at the ETH in Zurich in 1999, and some years after he founded Made in Geneva, I guess, and then they opened also an office in Zurich, if I'm not mistaken, together with Patrick Heiss. Before that, he worked with Terence Riley in New York, with Herzog and de Meuron in Basel, and in OMA in Rotterdam. So he was around some of the places that of architectural thought and practice that were more interesting in the turn of the century, probably. So that from that experience, I think all the interest that we got or we saw in his work came from there. And then after founding Made in 2003, he taught in EPFL and in Mendrisio and then in Zurich, where they were appointed, him and Hayes, full professors last year, I guess. Okay, full professors of architecture and design in the ETH in Zurich. Okay, I'm just reading the words that the report of the ETH was presenting when they were appointed. As architects, François Charbonnet and Patrick Hayes are masters of their trade. They participate in fundamental debates and social political discourses and are willing to take risk and assume responsibility. Moreover, they are experienced lecturers who have already taught as guest lecturers at a number of universities. By appointing François Charbonnet and Patrick Hayes, the Department of Architecture of the ETH Zurich has obtained the services of two outstanding exponents of the Swiss architecture scene who are at the height of their powers.
Now, first of all, I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to actually be here with all of you today. I think Fernando has tried to get in touch with me a few years ago, already last year or 2 years ago. Couldn't make it, so I'm very happy to finally be able to join you. As I was preparing this lecture, I thought it would be really interesting also to have a look back on what was developed at the ETH before we were named full professors for a series that we had called Portraits. And I'm only going to speak about the first 4 portraits. The portrait series lasted 6 semesters, 4 in Zurich and 2 in Mendrisio, and then were pursued later on also in Kyoto in a different way. But at the very beginning of Portrait was the idea that we should try to aim at teaching architecture in a different way as it's been taught over the last 120 years, I would say. I believe there is very little evolution in how to teach architecture from the Beaux-Arts movement, even if the modern movement has gone through. I still think that we're all, as students, have been somehow formated to actually follow a tutelary figure and to somehow aim at, well, let's say, if not edit, at least get close to what the master professor is doing. And this is something I really wanted to avoid. I always try to invite my students to not copy what we're doing, although there is a great potential in copying also, but I think that was not the point. And to try to escape from this idea that there is a professor that stands in the center who has all the knowledge and that you have to follow. So, and what we're doing right now at the ETH is not very different from that. We think that the professor should put himself in a difficult position and therefore also engage into uncertainties and to participate into a project more in a way, in an active way than simply in an authoritarian way. And the reason for which I tell you this is that that's the reason for which you see also Dubuffet. I could have chosen something else, but I thought Dubuffet would really portray what we were aiming at. And before we actually start with really the content of these portrait series, I wanted to position the series into the history of French thinking. And there is an author called Léon Brunswick, who is a philosopher, a French philosopher at the turn of the century, who's a very interesting person. And I don't know him very well, but I know one thing. He's written a book, which is a marvelous work in a certain way, but has mostly a marvelous title. And it's called Montaigne et Pascal, lecteur de Descartes. Can't do any better, right? So you got the three great figures of French philosophy brought together. And he says something fascinating. He says, Descartes has come to a point where he can say, I know. So he has the certainty of a knowledge. And then Pascal, who's also an interesting figure, he says, I believe. And believe is, of course, kind of not a blind conviction, but there's something behind this that you can fully explain, right? So between the knowledge, the certainty of the knowledge, the blind allegiance to a certain obedience, comes this guy called Montaigne and he says, I doubt. And I say this because I think there's a tendency to always be on the Descartes side and to say, I know, or to be on the Pascal side and to believe blindly onto something through convictions or through affinities. But we're more interested by the thinking of Montaigne, who says, I doubt. Therefore, every time he asserts something, he will question it. And for us, it stands at the center of any production of architecture. I don't consider any architectural project not raising a question to be an architectural project. An architectural project should be raising questions. And therefore, we tended to actually invite the students to be more onto the line of Montaigne than on the line of Pascal and Descartes. And that's a really important point to make. So what is portrait? And I will read. Portrait is a series of critical assessments on contemporary issues. Its specificity lies in the association of mutually enlightening, yet seemingly antagonist programs. Its method claims no historical loyalty, as sources and facts are being intentionally set up to serve a reducing purpose. Portrait evaluates contradictory encounters and stresses cross-fertilization as a key asset in the design process. The reason for which I quote this text, it was an introductory text on every reader of the semesters, is because it says also the structure of the lecture, but not only, it says also the structure of what the teaching environment was. It says a lot about its format, which is a series, about its ambition, which is criticality, about its method, the association, its limit, subjectivity, and its horizon, the fertilization of design. Portraits is not only that assessment and critical assessment on contemporary issues, it's also a series of warnings. And these warnings are what we call the negative frameworks. Why do I call them warning? Because there is an obvious statement to be made, a necessary contradiction to what is stated in the title of each portrait, Airport Prison, to prevent any confusion and to anchor into reality. It is obvious that the airport is not a prison. That finance is not a religion, yet in God we trust. That political philosophy is not territorial, but if you see the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' materialistic approach to politics, you will see that the body of the state is inhabited by the people, surrounded by a landscape. And architecture is, of course, not literary. These are extremely important. The negative framework is extremely important. This is something that we always told the students. Do not take the statement airport and prison as one-to-one overlapping of programmatic features. This is to be questioned. This is to be doubted about. But we want to bring the two together, and I will explain why we brought the two together. So beside these warnings, it's also a series of incentives. And this would constitute really the positive frameworks of the series. It's an introduction to all readers. It's the text that actually accompany all the readers, among also a selection of other curated texts. It's open statements. They're not closed unto themselves. They open doors to questions more than just be definitive statements. And there are invitations rather than mot d'ordre to be part of it. The first one of these incentives is Marcel Proust, and that will be the poetic agent of the series. Cuts loose from the objectivity. This is a part of À la recherche du temps perdu in the second book of À la recherche du temps perdu, which is called À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs. This is a title that I cannot translate. It's impossible to translate. It's the most beautiful title ever written in French, and no one can translate it. So it's À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs. And in this book, there is a moment where the main character is having a relationship, an intimate relationship, friendly relationship with a painter. And he's trying to describe what the painter is doing when he's doing a portrait. And he explains that cuts loose from any form of objectivity and engage into subjectivity. And in order to do a portrait, there needs to be at least an object, topic of the portrait, the painter and its subjectivity. And everything flows between this subjectivity and the object. And he cuts loose from this objectivity, engages, of course, into subjectivity, stresses its ability to reveal what is hidden. The portrait never embraces the full person. It always chooses one side of it and insists on it. It, of course, underlines also the limit of the method. The method of the portrait does not embrace the full complexity of the person. This is the first of the incentives. The second of the incentives is William S. Burroughs, which I would call the methodological agent, because in his text, The Electronic Revolution, which I will read, the ease of identity, you are an animal, you are a body. Now, whatever you may be, you are not an animal, you are not a body, because these are verbal labels. The ease of identity always carries the assignment of permanent condition, to stay that way. All name calling presupposes the ease of identity. This concept is unnecessary in a hieroglyphic language like ancient Egyptian, and in fact frequently omitted. The definite article the contains the implication of one and only, the God, the universe, the way, the right, the wrong. If there is another, then that universe, that way, is no longer the universe, the way. The definite article the will be deleted, and the indefinite article a will take its place. The whole concept of either or, right or wrong, physical or mental, true or false, the whole concept of or will be deleted from the language and replaced by juxtapositions, by and. This is the meaning of the slash between each of the components that actually set the terms of the, this analogical approach to a problematic feature. We'll come back to that. And I insisted also to every student to insist to the fact that it's a call for multiplicity. There's no such thing as an absolute in architecture or in any field. There's only specific cases and specific definitions of complexities. It condemns also the exclusivity of choosing. You don't have to choose airport and prison. It's not that I want to choose between the airport and prison. I want both of them. I want both features to be brought together in a meaningful whole. And the use of the conjunction, of course, explains, as I said, the slash set between every set of terms brought together. The third of the agents is the theoretical agent in a book called Morphology City Metaphors by O.M. Ungas, which was written in the 70s, where the theoretical agent talked about the polarization of thinking processes and divides thinking necessarily oscillating, describes the process of thinking in an oscillating process between empirical one, where scientific and facts are being measured and justified, and an intuitive process, which I think also this constant negotiation between objective reality and subjective is something that connects us also in our field of proficiencies, that of architecture. The fourth one, and one of the most relevant one we will see later on, is the Treatise on Nomadology, The War Machine by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which is a text that was published in Mille Plateaux, where they speak about a series of images, and they define what Husserl called the proto-geometry. We'll come back to that, which define a tension between ideal essences, imperial essences, and sensible essences. And he describes something extremely important in how to build up an image for an architectural project, in this case, in the process of portraits. He described an inexact appropriation of a form, therefore a form which would be exact in the way it's built up, but inexact in its coherence towards history. And what we're looking for is not an allegiance to, a blind allegiance to what history was, or let's say a prospective allegiance to what the future could well become, but in a way to actually build up new realities, new, not functionalities, but new meanings by bringing them together in a coherent way. So in other words, an image would become just in the association, and through the association becoming actually something else than what it used to be. And that was the goal of it. And yes, of course, during the semesters that we led at the ETH and in Mendrisio, we have produced a lot of images, we have used metaphors, we have staged analogies, we have interpreted signs and symbols, and we have written also allegories. This sets the tone of the approach in a certain way because we asked our students to be a little bit of a poet, a little bit of an anarchist, an architect, of course, and a philosopher. That's what you would need to be in order to promote a certain competence and a certain accuracy into the development of a project within the portrait series. So, behind the warnings and the incentives, there's also, of course, the contemporary problems. And the problems are the critical frameworks of the series portraits. And they precede, and it's important, any formulation of an hypothesis. What is the problem? And what are these problems? The first problem is that of the society of control. And it stems out of this great thesis by Michel Foucault, which was developed in Surveiller et Punir in the 70s, where Michel Foucault describes the evolution of our societies in the Western civilization from the 19th century on to our days, and describes this as such. So, the second half of the 19th century, he describes the society as a kind of a sovereign state, where there's a sovereign, there are subjects. And then, during the course of the end of this century and the beginning of the 20th century, there's a small shift going from sovereign state to what he called disciplinary state. These disciplinary states are really interesting because they coincide with the construction, and that concerns our field of action, the actual building of confinement facilities. These confinement facilities start with the first thing is the bourgeois family. The first confinement environment is that of the family. And then goes on, and in the second half of the 19th century, a lot of prisons were built, mental institutions, factories, and so on and so on. All confinement facilities for a society, a preconceived idea about societies. And comes the Second World War, and then comes Barras, who had an idea in a debate with Michel Foucault, and suggests an idea to Michel Foucault and says, well, from this disciplinary state that we know nowadays, there is going to be a small shift again, and we're going to go from disciplinary state to controlled states, which is completely different because they are concerned not by the confinement, they're concerned by supervision and monitoring. And we are nowadays, again, operating another shift. It would be interesting to treat that topic again. From the controlled state, we are going into a monitoring state, let's say a monitoring state today, which is a little bit different to that of the control state. But I want to point out the difference between a disciplinary state and a control state. In a control state, you are constantly free. You're free to do anything, but you're always under control. And Gilles Deleuze gives a very beautiful example. He says, you're on an expressway. You can go anywhere. You're free to leave the expressway anytime. But if you have an accident, the ambulance will be there in 20 minutes. Let's say in Switzerland in 10 minutes, and some other countries. You're always under control. And of course, it gets even beyond that with the technology of social medias today. You're not even under control, you're under surveillance. This is how it happens. And for me, it was absolutely essential that the students but start to understand in which world they are going to evolve. More than the competences as designers, I think what a university should be teaching is not teaching architecture as such. We're not instructing architecture as professors, we're instructing architects. That is, citizens with a political awareness. And that was at the center of the portrait series, to have the students who are 20, 22 years old, to become aware of what world they're going to be facing when they leave the university and engage into their profession. Therefore, the first problem is that of the society of control, which was suggested by Michel Foucault. The second one is that of the science of passionate interests. And here the idea was, the source is another one than Michel Foucault, is Gabriel Tarde, who was a sociologist and a philosopher, quite relevant in French thinking at the turn of the 19th century, but completely overwhelmed by another great thinker, Karl Marx. And Bruno Latour wrote a book called, what is it called? Économie, sciences des intérêts passionnés, where he described the philosophy and sociology of Gabriel Tarde, which has written his opus magnum, which is called Psychologie économique. He suggests a new need for an evaluation. Gabriel Tarde had foreseen 100 years before our obsession for statistics, where statistics was not even introduced by mathematics or anything like that. Gabriel Tarde was really a visionary thinker. He called for an absolute consideration of subjectivity in economics, not thinking that the mathematicians and the physicists would be able to actually, somehow foresee what would take place, and focuses on the irrational aspect of economy, and foresees, as I said, the contemporary obsession for statistics. It's an extremely interesting book, extremely interesting statement. We'll come back to that later on. We'll be describing more in detail the second topic of this second portrait series about economy. The third one, probably the most difficult one, was the portrait about territory and politics, which was addressing the issue about the ideological order of planning. And the reason for which we actually proposed such a topic, there was a kind of a hidden agenda for urbanization, because we had the feeling that beyond the typomorphological way of thinking a city, we had not been able to actually think the city as such. And we were searching for a standpoint of view which would lie outside of the field of architecture, and took political philosophy as a source in order to understand how our cities have been built up. But no one will contradict me if I say that political philosophy, to a certain extent, the way our societies are organized, define to a great extent the society into which, or the environment to which we actually evolve. And we were more interested into revealing the symptoms rather than establishing diagnoses and giving solutions to how to actually build our cities. But really to use the political philosophy as a filter, and to see how for example, communism or liberalism or democracy or totalitarianism had influenced the planning of our cities and how they could still influence the way we actually organize our societies. And the last one was an easier one, but a fascinating one too. We called it architecture literally. So instead of usually you're asked as an architect to work on the future of the lives of your clients in a certain way. You are going to be defining really the political environment into which their lives will be evolving in the future. But you're very seldomly asked to retroactively work onto something that has been developed already. And in architecturally, we propose to rebuild retroactively houses or situations or environments based on books, and books and art books, of course, books that have been literary, of course, relevant to the field of literature in the Western civilization, of course, and there to actually face the students with an exaggerated life in a certain way, because literature is nothing else than kind of an exaggerated contemplation of what life is, and therefore this exaggeration was really the interest to us, and to work retroactively. So there's a whole series of books that there was a Machine Infernale of Jean Cocteau, there was a À Rebours by Des Esseintes, and a whole series of books from different times also in history that were proposed to the students, and they had to rebuild retroactively actually the environment that was described in the book. Of course, these projects were highly exaggerated because the literary works were extremely exaggerated. And it was an interesting way of actually facing another problem that we're usually facing. Beyond these frameworks and these problems, which concerns contemporary problems, we propose a certain amount of hypotheses, which would be the programmatic framework of the project. And I will talk about two of them and then perhaps exemplify that with a project that we did also in our office. Portrait one was airport and prison. And the topic is the society of control, as I said. The reason for which we chose actually airport and prison was in a certain way, for a very long time, political institutions and authorities turned to architects to actually develop what their environment, to actually ask them what their environment would be. So in the turn of the 19th century, and beginning of the 20th century, institutions turned to architects and asked them, so what would be actually the best prison to be? I mean, you have also a whole series of projects, and a massive amount of prisons have been built at that time. Now, if you look at what happens with the airport, it's not exactly the same way that it takes place. In the airport facility, it is such a complex organism that the architect is just one element of a complex features or complex organizations, and therefore, in a certain way, the authority of the architect when he plans or designs an airport is in question. The architect is therefore replaced by a series of expertises. And airport and prison aims, of course, naively, but in a certain way at reconquering a certain authority when designing an airport. And therefore to actually propose layouts by airports designed based on sources which would be that of prisons, and the reason for which we take prisons, I will explain that now, and this is basically really the whole thesis behind those portrait series. So if I take the society of control and take the word control, we're extremely interested also in etymology. You will realize that control covers several meanings. It has mainly two meanings, one of them being the restraint and the check for the security, and the other one would be that of regulation and operation and performance. So one of the issue of control is dealing with the issue of security, and the other one is dealing with performance. Therefore, control oscillates between a performative component and a coercive one, the coercive one being a subcategory of the performative aspect, as in a prison. Now, control is circumscribed always to a territory, and that territory here is a project by the students where they had to prove that the Vatican City had the components of a prison, had the limits, the border of a territory, and that's what they had done. In a certain way, they did not design anything. They reconquered an existing situation and tried to develop it and used history as a tool of investigation to actually investigate on what a morphology like that of St. Peter would be if it were to be used as a performative infrastructure. And if I quote here Michel Foucault, it's to actually describe what this territory is. The territory is not simply just a surface with a limit. It is built from aspect, this is the quote, it is built from aspect or portions of milieus. It itself has an exterior milieu, an interior milieu, an intermediary milieu, and an annexed milieu. It has the interior zone of a residence or a shelter, the the exterior zone of its domain, more or less retractable limits and membranes, intermediary or even neutralized zones, and energy reserves and annexes. This is an extremely precise and accurate description of what a milieu could be in the field of architecture, but not only, it describes also not only just substantial, just the substance, the built substance, which does not actually build the political environment. This is also something we have to call upon. Any political environment being defined between two people is really what defines the political environment, not the built substance. And it's also important to see that the Greek polis is not being defined as the Parthenon or anything like that. The Greek polis, in the Greek sense of the world, and this is where politics begins, is any space between at least two people. You need at least two people to make politics. So if I say this, it's very convenient for architecture because of the very exteriority of architecture. Any architecture is an act of policy, and therefore the awareness of this act of policy, that any design is an act of policy, should be brought as a major feature in the field of architecture. So what I want to do now is basically celebrating. I don't know if you've seen a few years later, this is something that mind-boggled me. A few years later, after this image was produced, because this project was then sent by the students, not by us, but by other students, to an open competition for the future of airports. And they won a prize, of course. And then later on, I was once in Paris, and I realized that Air France had done a commercial with the A380 landing in Versailles. And it was exactly this image. And they had said, His Majesty A380. That was the commercial. It was recycled, without telling the students, by Air France to produce an image. But what I want to do today is not to talk about this. I want to talk about the encounters. Portraits is about celebrating encounters. And I want to do that with the prison and the airports. The first thing I want to say is about the occupancy of an airport and a prison. And it has three types, if you have to, let's say, to make a list of what these types are. There's the mobile object, there's the insular object, and the continental objects. In a certain way, they all occupy different territories, they all deal with the limits differently, we'll see that. But these three occupations are the three ones that actually the airport and prison both actually tend to occupy. You can see here, for example, the prison barge. This was all airports. You have the aircraft carrier, the artificial island, Alcatraz, I think this is, I don't know. And the third one, which is on the continent. And this is a prison, where you have the prison barge. I think this is Alcatraz in the center, and Almere detention facility in the Netherlands. They also share a common relationship with limits, except that they work differently in the opposite way. The airport is a jurisdictional independent entity as a territory, and aims in its fence, in its most outskirts physical manifestation, to excluding the people from this territory, because it's a special territory with its own legislation. Within the prison, the same wall addresses not the prevention from people coming into the territory, but prevent the people from escaping that territory. In other words, it's extremely interesting because the physicality of the components are the same, so you will see that. And you see here, for example, the physical limits that you can see. The the mobile object is its own, the limit of its own body constitute the limits also of the territory. Within, on a territorial level, the facilities and the permeabilities are different, of course, but the features are always the same. They use exactly the same kind of features in order to delimit really what this limit is. And what we see also here in the prison as well as in the airport is this wall is not simply just a wall that actually sets a limit once and for all, but it has a physical component, the wall, a fence, a barbed wire. It also has literary components like keywords, or the mots d'ordre, where around these facilities you find all these kind of warnings and keywords that actually prevents you from entering that perimeter. And not only this, both of them use a lot of prosthetic features as auxiliaries, right? Either natural components or prosthetic features. In other words, the wall is a layering of expertise. You can see here an image by the students where they took actually the Berlin Wall as a kind of a facility to actually implement, actually in between the void between the two cities, actually the runways of the airport. It's also an encounter of typologies. So we see the Gatwick Terminal on the left by Maurice Jackman in 1936, and a prison project by Jean-François de Neufforge in the 18th century. The concentric one, the linear one, as you see here, these are two examples, or the arborescent one. So they share not only just a relationship with territory, but as also share a way of actually organizing a floor plan. It is also an encounter in the architectural repertoire. They are all used to the old and simple scheme of confinement and enclosure, thick walls and heavy gates that prevents entering or leaving, began to be replaced by a calculation of openings and filled and empty spaces, passages, and transparencies. Let's make a short list. It's not exhaustive, but I think that's where they share also. The canopy is an architectural feature that is being used both in the airport and in the prison. The corridor, of course, here in examples of Prairie's Parvis, which is a student's project for an airport in Chicago. The corridor. Here in the project by a student called Walkway. In Fluxus, it was a fictional airport for the CIA where it was lost in the desert, buried underground. The only thing you would see is basically the staircase leading to the thing, and everything was about flows. So basically you would actually flow into a tube, a pipe, and then reach the different terminals, not knowing exactly where you would be sent to. The tower, of course. This is another project by the students for a linear project. You can see here where an office building is brought together with an aircraft carrier as a kind of a hybrid structure. The membranes and the gangways, the project we saw previously, the membranes that I was talking about in the prison and in the airport facilities. This is typical boarding gates and recycling of existing images. And of course prosthetics that are everywhere in both facilities. Not talking just about cameras, but also all the prosthetics features that actually deal with security, not only but also performative aspects. For example, here in Ariane's Thread, a great project with the students where they build actually the airport as a kind of a maximum exposure to shopping facilities as a kind of labyrinthine feature. We'll come back to that. And then there's, of course, this difference in repetition, which is again a title by a book by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, but also points out to another feature in the airport and the prison. Shopping facility is, the container is always the same, but the content is always different, just like in a prison. The inmate is always different, but the container itself is always the same and repeated. And therefore, this cell system being repeated as a structure allows for a differentiation of the content, but not of the container itself. In Ariane's Threads, it embraces a certain comprehension of what the airport is. This is a project by the students, which was called Ariane's Thread. They tried to develop the airport as a labyrinthine reality, and they took over this definition of the airport of the 21st century, described in a work by OMA, I think, in Shopping Mall. The combination of airport and shopping has triggered an as yet unacknowledged paradigm shift from efficiency and overly delivering on function to delaying it. The good airport used to be defined by its clarity, the efficiency with which it delivered passengers to and from a place. The new airport is essentially a labyrinthine one. It works by slowing down passengers, dragging them in the most circuitous manner past shop frontages, and coercing them into making airport shopping the highest yielding sales per square foot of any shopping time. Of course, this is not by us, but this is also, I want to talk about also the technique of the images, where two images are brought together as a diptychon in order to actually suggest the idea of the labyrinthine reality of the projects. And you can see here an overview of the building itself, where all you see here is basically a project by Fischer von Erla, actually, which has been then edited and augmented into a pyramidal function where the passenger is being brought, checks in at the ground level, is being shot up all the way to the top of the pyramid, and then goes down into this labyrinthine reality being exhibited to maximum exposure of shopping. This was for the first portrait series. The second portrait series is dealing with the issue of finance and religion, and of course the hypothesis is that of the science of passionate interest. And here, as I said, I want to quote just briefly a short passage of Bruno Latour's book on Gabriel Tarde, and he says the following thing: "It remains true that value, of which money is but the sign, is nothing, absolutely nothing, if not a combination of entirely subjective things, of beliefs and desires, of ideas and volitions, and that the peaks and troughs of values in the stock market, unlike the oscillations of a barometer, could not even remotely be explained without considering their psychological causes. Fits of hope and discouragement in the public, propagation of a good or bad sensational story in the minds of spectators." So if we keep that in mind, that architecture economy is driven not only by objective interests, but subjective ones, then we can engage also into, let's say, a brief overview of what economy has become over the history. And I think if you go back to the origin, I think you all know that passage of the Bible, with the expression of the money changers, where Jesus says, "And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all of who were selling and buying in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the chairs of them that sold doves. And he says to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayers, but you have made it a den of thieves.'" So, even at the origin, there seems to be a coincidence of geography between the exchange of matters and the cult. Even in the Greek, where the thesaurus, a storage of valuable foreign states, so the thesaurus would actually be kind of the ancestors of the banks, not literally as such, because they were actually only the values that were brought after conquering certain territories. And I think it's extremely interesting to see also not only the reality of the thesaurus as an institution, of what it could actually fulfill as a function, but also what it is as an image. And you will see why it is so important. There's a similarity, of course, of the architectural language will be used later on in the stock exchange. But there's also a great proximity between these buildings and the cult buildings. The thesaurus here in Delphi, the Delphi treasury, were very close also to the shrines. Therefore, there is also a common ground on which finance, or let's say economy, and the cult and the religion have occupied the territories for obvious reasons, of course, throughout history. But it's really important actually to see, for example, here in Western societies, you see the proximities of financial institutions with religious institutions, and you can even witness that still today, where Trinity Church is set next to what? To the stock exchange in New York. And I would go even further down. The reason for which these buildings actually look like that is that when the stock exchange came about in the second half of the 19th century, the people behind these institutions were not really quite sure that the people would cope with that. So they said they were really untrustful. They thought people would not trust to place their money anywhere else but in the bank, where it would be safe. Therefore, they had the strategy, and it was a conscious strategy, to recycle the iconography of the Greek temple and the churches in order for the people to convey, let's say, a very comfortable and a secure image to what these institutions would be. And therefore, in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when those institutions, those buildings came about, you realize that they were all look alike, and they all look kind of very similar to what the Greek temples were, with a very monumental order in order to promote a certain stability and an idea. And there you see how architecture can instrumentalize also the way society is organized or perceived. It's all a matter of perception, and that they were really very much aware of that. You see that also, of course, in London, where the city and St. Paul also compete in the image of the skyline. And if we go back even further into history, there's a great fascination also for what the basilica was. The basilica, before it became the main type for religious architecture, before it was that, it was a marketplace. It was a matrix onto which an exchange could take place. Therefore, the pilaster structure of a basilica, which was then recycled by Christianity, is not that of a cruciform object revealing the nature of the cross onto which Christ was, but it's a matrix guaranteeing not the exchange to take place, but guaranteeing the potentiality of the exchange to take place. Therefore, it's a neutral grid. It's a fascination for the industrial grid that actually was developed in the Basilica. Before it became a religious building, it was a place of exchange. And then again, we come back to philosophy because you cannot think the world without these guys. And there's a great philosopher which I'm very interested in, I'm not the only one, I know that, but Friedrich Nietzsche had foreseen that way before the ethnologist. At the time where the ethnologists would say that the primitive societies would barter and only barter, Nietzsche proposed another way of actually depicting the origins of what economy would be. And he realized that people would not barter, really, so therefore they would not simply just exchange objects, they would create blocks of debts. And the difference between barter and the blocks of debts, it's barter plus time. In other words, it's barter delayed. So the idea of a debt, before it became a Christian and Jewish topic recycled by the priests, which was then instrumentalized in order to become the infinite debt towards God, was an economical idea, which was then set in action by primitive societies before Christianity and the Jewish priest was invented. So the debt as an economical feature and not the barter was at the center of what the first exchanges were within the primitive societies. Then recycled, reused, edited into what he called the infinite debt to God. And that was his problem. Nietzsche was very often described as an anti-Semite, and he was not anti-Semite. I've read a lot of Nietzsche, and of course, if you read Nietzsche on a superficial level, it's a very, very dangerous reading. But if you start to get into it and to get really into the detail, you realize that as Gilles Deleuze explains it, and I'm saying it was very precautionous words, I'm saying he does not reproach the Jewish people anything else than to have invented something that was not there before, the figure of the priest. The priest did not exist before the Jewish people. They invented the figure of the priest. There were scripts, there were gurus and stuff like that, but they were not the priest. And the priest invents one specific feature, which is a problem for Nietzsche, and I will explain why. He says, he invents one thing. I have nothing against the priest, I have nothing against the Christian nor the Jewish. He invents one thing which is problematic. He invents the idea, not even the idea of the debt, he invents the idea of the infinite debt. As long as the debt is finished, you can always free yourself from that debt. But if the debt is infinite, you cannot free yourself from it. And that was the largest reproach of Nietzsche to the Christian and the Jewish invention of the priest. Both were also aimed at conquest. If you see here the conquest of Christianity from 33rd after the death of Christ to 2000, you will see here this massive spread. And you will see also what economy does from 1950 to 2003. There's an acceleration. There's a massive acceleration, and these actually are not similar acceleration. Of course, the profound sources and the reasons for which these take place are not similar. This also insists. That's why I started with the warnings. You cannot confuse finance and religion. Religion is not finance, and finance is not religious. Yet they share a lot of features in common. The probability feature also. And that's also I call upon the factor of uncertainty and call upon common use of mathematics by Blaise Pascal, which was a great mathematician also, as you all know. And in one of his books, in his Pensées, the most famous book by Pascal, his Pensées, he develops a great, I don't know how to call it. It's kind of it's a concept, so it's a way of thinking. Concept have nothing else, no reality outside of philosophy. Therefore, you can leave the word concept and not use it in the field of architecture, but it's a concept of thinking, and he's actually betting onto something. He's not concerned literally by the existence of God. He wants to measure the life of someone who believes in God and compare it to the life of someone who does not believe in God. And he says the following thing: there is not an infinite distance between the certainty, and I want you not to understand everything that is at stake in his text, but I want you to actually listen to what the words he uses in order to depict a religious matter. There is not an infinite distance between the certainty staked and the uncertainty of the gain. That is untrue. In truth, there is an infinity between the certainty of gain and the certainty of loss. But the uncertainty of the gain is proportioned to the certainty of the stake according to the proportion of the changes of gain and losses. In other words, he speaks like an economist. And he evaluates, as I said, the respective lives of a believer versus the life of a non-believer. He uses the same kind of language and the rhetoric. There's a factor of uncertainty, and you look at this factor of uncertainty. This is the curve of the Nikkei curve of the Japanese index over 30 years. And you can see that there's no way any of these economies can foresee what is going to take place, because it works, as Gabriel Todd was trying to depict, as a fever. It works with access of crisis and downturns and breakdowns. There's no stability in the economy because it's driven by obscure forces and subjective forces also. And there's not only this, but he even goes beyond this, because Pascal was a great mathematician. He even uses the same formulas as the economists would use, minus b plus infinity, God exists, and so on and so on. So he uses a formula, goes down to this formula, which defined really the economy in the last 40 years, which was developed in the 1970s. No one really understands what is going on with this formula. They still use this to depict. They still use that kind of formula to actually investigate what the future of economy will be. So they don't only use the same rhetoric at the same time, they also share signs. You will see the signs. Here are the signs on the left side for economy, on the right side for Christianity. In God we trust. In Goldman Sachs we trust. They also use the signs to depict realities and to communicate between different kinds. They share secrets also. They share morphologies. This is not from us. This was already in the book by Rancolas. They share a common iconography. And I want to show an example of someone who has been probably foreseeing what was going to take place later in his time. This is a movie by Michelangelo Antonioni from 1960. It's called The Eclipse, and I think we're just going to watch this short sequence, and then I'm going to make the point of it.
Ricordando con parole all'altra, ti prego, ricordando
So I propose we go through this short sequence and see what is there, because you realize that the Rome Stock Exchange is taking place in a shrine, in a former church, which was it's the temple. So you got all the elements. We're in the stock exchange. Remember, I mean, Alain Delon is a broker, and he's actually trying to get out with Monica Vitti, and they're actually this whole place is taking place into this shrine. So we've got the temple, we've got the naves, we've got the fervor, we have the secrets, the confessional, the signs, the priest, the congregation, and the psalms. And that would build up really the environment. So what I'm trying to say is that during the series of portraits, we try to, as a technique, as a methodology, you could actually kind of define the methodological framework as kind of a détournement. The détournement is, I mean, of course, loaded with certain meanings, because the first time it appeared, it was by Lettrist International, like a later called International Situationist, was used for the first time by Guy Debord in 1957. The technique was of the détournement was consisting in turning expression of the capitalist system and its media culture against itself, as in the case of slogans that were turned against the advertisers and political status quo. The opposite would be that of the récupération, in which radical ideas are being twisted and softened or commodified to become socially and politically more acceptable. So we're not dealing with récupération in the case of portraits, we're dealing with the derailing, the détournement, which is very difficult to translate because it's not exactly derailment or turnabout, but this is taking something and actually aiming at something else by using the same methodology. So it's a kind of a variation on pre-existing media. And here's the quote, which actually is relevant to the understanding of this methodology. Any elements, no matter where they are taken from, can be used to make new combinations. The discovery of modern poetry regarding the analogical structure of images demonstrate that when two objects are brought together, no matter how far apart the original context may well be, a relationship is always formed. And therefore, that condition of a new relationship being formed, intentionally, unexactly brought together, that is, not exactly in respect to what history was or in respect to what the future might well become, but unexactly, that is, rigorously built up as a meaningful new coherence. I want to show you here, in order to create new meaningful relationships. In other words, the history is convened to produce new meanings and relationship, but it's never used as a legitimation or a motive, and it's only used as a tool of comprehension. In other words, I never invited the students to actually do a pastiche architecture, but to promote themselves as a kind of actors within a political environment, to understand, to use history in order to actually search for new meanings within history, and to actually state that history is alive and nothing is past. So here's a typical example of a récupération or détournement where the morphological reality of St. Peter is investigated under the performative aspects of an airport. You'll see how the different naves are being used and how the different morphologies are being used as thresholds between the different moments of the facilities. The reason for which I insist on this is that, as René Char mentions it, our heritage is preceded by no testament. We don't know what to do with our heritage, and no one tells you what to do with our heritage. In other words, if we keep it as such, we won't be using it. If we destroy it, we're also on the wrong side of it. But the idea is to mobilize history as a tool to promote a certain understanding of what society is today, the world is today, and to project yourself in the future. Not as a legitimation, but really to ask the present question in the past tense. And that's really what it was about. So you see, for example, I want to show the different détournements. I'm not going to get into the details of all the projects, but you can see here, Gian Battista Piranesi has these fragments of history. Piranesi had a very accurate understanding of what history was, but he was nevertheless understanding that you only have a partial and fragmental understanding what history is. History always comes to us fragmental and never fully embracing its own reality. And here, what they did is that they did a work on a system which was called anarchy. And the anarchic system that they developed here was not about the architecture itself, but about the programmatic ventures around our allocations of programmatic realities within our cities. So there's a great turnaround and turnover of our programmatics. And actually, the statement about anarchic architecture in this sense would not be anarchic architecture, would be to say that the architecture, because it's transgenerational by nature, aims as a kind of a factor of permanence. And it aims also at this, as Piranesi was trying to promote through his engraving, to this image done by the students, brought together all these elements of use in Paris together as a kind of a permanence feature. In other words, their study of anarchy was not to promote an anarchic architectural feature, but to point out to what is anarchic in our city is not the architecture itself, but the programmatic ventures and turnarounds within our cities. Or the Merchant of Venice being determined by the propaganda horizon into great events, worldwide events, here in this case the Olympics in London. Fischer van Erlach as the Labyrinth of Crete, which is a plan for civil and historical architecture being recycled here, as I said, and then turned into a pyramid as a maximum exposure to shopping issues. Map of the Inferno, Dante's Divine Comedy illustration by Botticelli, brought together with the Carcere Dimensioni by Piranesi into a portraiture of what a stock exchange would be today in New York, an underground one, arena, bring together all the actors together in a spectacular feature. Or for example, Chicago, Daniel Burnham's and Wood Bennett's plan for the city being fully completed in a monumental gesture where the airport is taking place and fully embracing the circular structure of the main ring of Chicago, and therefore placing the airport, O'Hare Airport, onto the Lake of Michigan, and actually sustaining also the access and the great morphological nature of the plan of the city. Or the Newton cenotaphs. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't see anything here, so I have to skip that. Here, a very interesting work by the students about democracy, where they depict democracy as a kind of a long attempt to acquire these acquis sociaux, and they speak about what turns at the end of the Second World War, where the first Le Front Populaire came about, and the people who actually were workers for the first time had paid holidays. There was an absolute revolution in France, and the people, the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, could not understand why these workers all of a sudden could actually take that. And therefore, they actually point out to this singular aspect of democracy, the gain of free time and space. And they depict actually Paris as a kind of a digestive tube of contemplation. They redrew Paris. You can't see that properly now because the print is bad. But in other words, they actually circle Paris, and what they actually depict Paris as a kind of a pipe, a digestive pipe for contemplation, where you're always into a tube and always controlled from the airplane into the conveyor belt, into the escalators, into the hotel, to the bus. You visit the thing, and what you get is basically this: a collection of images brought together, and no coherence and no reality with the reality of the city. So what you see is really the product of democracy. All the aircraft carrier brought together with all platform, defining a new type of airport, which would be the mobile airport, brought together in different segments. And instead of building an airport for any Olympic or any World Cup, then this airport would travel around the world, never stopping and making pit stops in different places of the world, becoming a non-permanent infrastructural airport. Or the geography being really radically changed by the social media today in this project for a data bank where literally our own values are being stored somewhere we don't really know. For a long time we knew where it was, either underneath the mattress at home or in the bank, but today the geography has completely changed. We don't know where our values are. So there's a really radical change. You can see here the picture on the left, and the change of geography, which is a radical change we are being undergoing at the moment. Or, for example, the morphological use of Santivo la Sapienza by Borromini, brought together with the triangle of Blaise Pascal to depict what? A rating agencies. This is a building for a rating agency. And you have to know how these rating agencies work. Huh? This is really interesting. They work in groups of 2 or 3 people, and each cell of 3 people is separated from the other by firewalls, so that they cannot influence each other. In other words, these rating agencies, and they have a massive influence on what the course of the world is. This is how it works. They have small groups of people, specialists, accumulating data, then promoting a certain communication, and it works by triangulation. So you have each unit, I would say like each Borromini would be 1 unit, right? And then what they do is they communicate by triangulation to another unit which stands higher above, all the way to the center of the structure where the oracle comes out. And then they promote this idea in all the press of the world, and they say Spain is B- today. That's exactly how it works. We are never asking them to justify themselves. They have a massive impact on what society can become. And they're working like a completely autonomous, obscure, and non-transparent facilities. And something that summarizes really what we wanted to actually depict by means of portrait. Here's Canaletto. Canaletto, this is La Piazzetta. This is extremely interesting. Canaletto never painted Venice as such. He brought different parts of Venice together. And that was his understanding, his vision of Venice. We cannot look at a Canaletto painting and say this was Venice at the time, because it's a fiction of what Venice was at the time. And interestingly enough, what we wanted to do with portrait was a little bit this, to use architecture as a pictorial tool to produce architecture. And what takes place is this: from this painting by Canaletto, democracy appears. And this is really the methodology that stands behind, I think, portraits. In other words, it goes back to what Thomas Struth is doing in his painting, in his pictures. You don't know if you know these pictures by Thomas Struth that he has taken in Le Uffizi in Florence, where you have a massive amount of people and you see a painting above. And if you want to visit those places nowadays, you have no other choice than to actually embrace these people within the artwork. And that's what we're trying to do. The boat and the ship has to be introduced, has to be embraced within the city in order to be able to actually support and stand that vision. And strangely enough, the detailing of the morphology of the ship itself works very well onto the Piazzetta, embraces this reality in a new manner. This would be, for the thing, and this is the last statement. This is a statement by Osip Mandelstam, which is a Russian poet, which died, I think, between the two wars, I'm not sure. And he said something very beautiful about memory. He said, "Ma mémoire est non d'amour, mais d'hostilité, et travaille non pas à reproduire, mais à écarter le passé." Therefore, it's not about pastiche. It's not about praising the past. This whole work of portraits is about hostility towards history, not hostility as an aggressivity, but hostility as a necessity in order to promote a certain understanding of society and to project yourself in the future. This is how we work in the office, and this is how we want to teach architecture. Now, if you still have time to listen to him, if you still have the bravery to listen to me for 15 more minutes, I can show you an example of an architecture we have produced by means of this technique. If not, we can stop there. It's up to you. Okay. This is a project by a Spanish architect. It's being built. It was open 2 weeks ago. It's a competition we handed in for the new Muséum des Beaux-Arts in Lausanne. I could speak about the project, but I'm not interested in speaking about the project itself. No. Because the project has its own reality, and I think I want to depict here in the light of what we heard before. No, we can talk about it afterwards if you wish, but I mean, basically this is it. So in this case here, what you will see here are the boards that we handed in, and these are the boards. They could be described as, like, let's say, scale representation. I wanted to speak about how we represent architecture in our own field. These are scale representations, and of course the project is very similar also to a certain aspect of the actual project today, but it aims also here, you can see the basilica, also you can see here the floor plan of the basilica, storage facility, and engage into a kind of an obsessive staging of infrastructural ways from the northern parts of the cities, the western part of the cities, also questioning what is actually a landmark building. There was a landmark building on this side. We decided to raise that landmark building in a critical consideration of what it was. What is actually could be kept was the infrastructure as such. Therefore, we invented this idea that the footprint of the building should be minimal, therefore to convey also this idea of the infrastructure. And to also seize the opportunity for once and for all, because it's very seldomly that you can do that in Europe, to actually build a new street in a city. And this whole idea of solidifying the city by building a new street and except doing everything but an object was really what interested us in this project. Again, I won't get into the detail, but you have a commercial use on the ground floor. The underground floor was not foreseen as part of the program, but we had seen, and this is a reality today, that the future of the main station would be that underground would be expanded. And this is what is taking place today. They're going to build the underground. But at the time, they thought we were too big and too large. They thought we had 5,000 square meters too much. We said, yes, but these 5,000, you're going to make money out of it. Then they got interested and they said, but what? How are you going to make money with this? And they said, because you're going to extend the underground. And they said, yeah, but it's not going to take place today, but it's going to take place in the future. Today, it's taking place. Therefore, they actually criticized what we were doing, but they actually realized what we were doing. So, scale representation, images and illustrations. So, I will have here to create short text. It's extremely important. It speaks about the inexactitude of the elaboration of an image. Husserl speaks of a proto-geometry that addresses vague, in other words, vagabond or nomadic morphological essences. These essences are distinct from sensible things as well as from ideal, royal, or imperial essences. Proto-geometry, the science dealing with them, is itself vague, in the etymological sense of vagabond. It is neither inexact, like sensible things, nor exact, like ideal essences, but unexact, yet rigorous, that is, essentially and not accidentally inexact. The circle is an organic, ideal, and fixed essence, but roundness is a vague and fluent essence, distinct both from the circle and things that are round, a vase, a wheel, the sun. A theorematic figure is a fixed essence, but its transformations, distortions, ablations, and augmentations, all of its variations form problematic figures that are vague yet rigorous, lens-shaped, unbelly-formed, or indented. It could be said that vague essences extract from things a determination that is more than thinghood, choséité, which is that of corporeality, and which perhaps even implies an esprit de corps. So you have everything that we're interested in. There's the body, the ideal essences, the perception of these forms also as an architect, but not only, and the geometry. So I would go very pedagogically through all the steps that led to the images that we have produced. Illustrations, we started with illustrations which we could call, in light of this text that we've just read on Husserl's philosophy, as objective essences. And here's what we would do. These are the Galleria degli Uffizi. In other words, you have an image, the caption itself, which is called also in French a legend. It's important. A legend is two things, right? The caption, and at the same time also a legend is a story. Galleria degli Uffizi. In other words, the text describes really what the image is. Carson Pierce Scott, La Galerie des Machines by Ferdinand Duterre, La Gare Centrale, La Grande Galerie du Louvre, which is shown here during the wartime, not as a cynical gesture, but to show really what the organization is and not about the artwork. The Mannheimer Schloss Zimmerfurt, or the Enfilade, USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, and the Alp. These are objective essences, and everything you see here are illustrative. Now, in the course of the process of developing the project, these illustrations of these realities, these objective essences, are brought up to epitomic natures, which we call ideal essences. And if you do the same exercise, I would say that it's not the Galleria degli Uffizi anymore, it's the knowledge, the trade, the forces, the place, the space, the order, the form, and the nature. Brought together, they form images, inexact essences, not yet unexact essences, not yet proto-geometries. This is the text I just read before, where the definite article is being dropped, and we only use the indefinite article, which stands for multiplicities. Therefore, from the knowledge, it becomes a museum and a department store, a structure and a context, a scenography and an enfilade, a morphology that is a logic of the form before the form, and the landscape. Brought together in a combination, they become proto-images, unexact essences, an interior, although it's exterior, an infrastructure, an exterior, and a superstructure. Super meaning in Latin what is beyond, and therefore here the whole building is turned around opportunistically and aims at addressing the issue which is beyond the city of Lausanne, that is of the landscape. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. So, I think we have some time for some questions, if someone has, hopefully yes. We can do it in Spanish also if you prefer, okay? Whoever wants to start.
Feels like in Switzerland. Switzerland, they never ask any
We need time,
questions.
you know?
No.
What happens normally when you finish?
Well, it's the same kind of things. And I always invite the people. I always tell them, I don't bite. I would like to know, and then I get the questions much later on.
Yes, François. Just like a very probably like a very innocent and simple question. But I mean, regarding the first part of the lecture and the exercises you showed us, we were wondering, I mean, which year they do belong to. I mean, are they master's program exercises? Are they undergraduate program exercises?
They're both.
They're both?
Graduate and master programs, yes.
And this series of courses, which were called like portraits, right? And the thing is, when there are master program exercises, I can understand they are producing like a certain kind of thought out of this kind of oppositions, right? These oppositions are used as methodologies, you said, like this methodological framework to understand that, I mean, you can build something new out of something that was already there, and then we can understand, or we were wondering, the deputy director and me, that, I mean, those beautiful images and drawings were complemented with a text.
Yeah. What we demand the students is it's very often the same, even though we've done quite a few semesters now in Switzerland and somewhere else, but they always kind of mind boggle, they're puzzled, because most of the time, and it's not a critic, I think this is also what we tell them, you have to go through all the studios, you don't have to go just through our own studios. What the worst that happens is that there would be a cultic aspect to what portrait would have become, because I know some people have also moved from Zurich to Mendrisio or to the portrait series and so on. This is something I really wanted to avoid. In other words, but they are facing an issue. They want to speak about objects, and we tell them we're going to speak about politics and realities outside of the field of architecture. Not to pretend that we're philosophers. I always tell them I'm an architect. I'm not only an architect. I'm no philosopher. I'm no sociologist. I'm no mathematician whatsoever. I'm an architect, but I leave the field of architecture as an architect to better understand what is going on around us. And to promote architecture as a way to depict or to actually embrace or to critically address certain features. I told you about this story about this project that we did for the IPIF, where there was a political issue behind this, and it's like this for every project we hand, most of the project we hand in. There's a question about, and then the students are being facing with that. They're facing a reader, which is a series of texts and images, and they also have a program of movies that are being shot. So there's a screening series. So during the whole semester, they're being accompanied to read text, to actually watch movies, to select images, to learn how to choose an image from one to another, to actually, and to build up like new stories and argumentation. Therefore, what you see here is always hand in like 6 boards, 3 images plus 3 boards of drawings of some kind, either floor plans or section. They had to make a selection, and they had a whole argument which would last 15 to 20 minutes. There is no way they could simply just paste the thing. And the reaction was really interesting within the school, because the first semester we did was airport and prison was the easiest one for the very reason it was typomorphological. Therefore, they could use the tools that we would put them in their hands, and they could build up on it. So it was an easy semester. It was very, very successful. The second semester was more difficult. Finance and religion is already a topic which is then slightly off the typological issues, although, as we have shown, there are serious coincidental features between the two worlds. And then became really difficult with politics and territory, because political philosophy is so far-fetched from any architectural realities that we were facing real problems there. But we managed to accompany them. As I said, I'd never start a semester knowing everything. Therefore, I always start the semester with the same kind of ignorance than the students, and I want it to be like that. I don't want to teach something I know. I teach what I search. I don't teach what I know. And therefore, it's part of the whole thing. What we're doing right now is a studio called Voluptas. And Voluptas is about, it's very different to portrait, because it's not aiming at using architecture as a pictorial way of depicting something. It's about creating a new world, a new reality, an urban reality which would not be based on necessities and political or economical necessities, but would be built on desire. And therefore, we ask the students to build up a city or an urban environment based on their own desires. And the idea is to kind of take the temperature of this new generation which is coming about now, because I'm personally very concerned about what's going on in the field of architecture today and the world as such. Therefore, that's why I insist on the fact that we do not teach architecture. We are training architects. We are training people with a political awareness, which will be acting as actors, not authors, as actors within the field of society. This is at the center of the teaching.
Yeah, either way, I mean, in the end, what you're teaching your students is a way of building narratives. These narratives that, in a way, they will. I mean, when we saw your work,
yes, they are building narratives, but they're not building narratives for the sake of the story. They were building. Let's say, in a certain way, they do that, but the narrative is always revealing something. I asked the students to build up stories because I think through stories you reveal also a certain reality. And architecture is not simply just a plot, a legislation, a budget, and a client. If this is it, then I quit. I leave this room and I quit. I'm not interested. Do you understand? This is much more complex than this. And this is the great feature about architecture, is that we stand at the center of so many contradictory interests, so many conflicting interests, that there is no other way for the architects to remain something that everyone hates today, a generalist. And all kind of educational purposes should aim at forming not specialists, but generalists, people with a political awareness that can engage in the criticality. And if we don't do that, the resistance is nowhere. That's it. This is what is going on with our cities today. Is of course very sad. And I'm not here to moan. I'm very happy at the time at which I live. I don't wish to live in the 17th or 18th century. I'm very happy with my time. But there is a certain reality which is kind of anguishing, I find. And everything that took place in the 90s and 2000 with those extremities that we've seen, I work for these people. I know them. I know how it works. They have not quite been able, I'm not the only one to think that. This generation has not really been able to point out to what the problem was within our cities, although there's, even a great author like Prem Koolhaas could point out to certain realities without really promoting any real consistent proposal for the city. So, in a way, I would like the students to be aware of that. I would like the students also to engage into a reality which goes beyond the fetishism for the object. I would like the students to search within history their own necessities. History is not dead, it's not even past, as William Faulkner said. We have to believe those guys also. You have to read them seriously. You just don't take a book by book, Faulkner or Nietzsche, just read the last page, just close the book and this is it. That's called archiving. This is of no purpose. There is no need to do that. If you have to see something, you have to promote a certain something. And of course, we are constantly in contradiction. I know that, for example, Adam Caruso, which is a dear friend and a dear architect, dear colleague, wouldn't think, when he saw the project for the airport, he was absolutely scandalized. He said, this is not possible. You can't do that. You can't do that. And that's exactly the reaction I wanted to have. This is you can't just do it. We have to do it. We have to do it for the students to know what the reality of St. Peter is today. Because you have the historians who will tell you what Palazzo Strozzi is, how it came about, and all these things. And that's great. You need to know that. And then what? And then what? Please. As a designer, what do I do with that? I just praise the object, that's it? No. I want to understand what Borromini did. I want to understand what Michelangelo did, and not to compare myself with those guys, to understand how it came about. And I say this with a great seriousness, because these people who have done the airport, what they did at some point is they came to me and they had just they redrew. No, the first thing they did, they scanned the object, right? They took a plan, and then they scanned the object and they started to draw the lines. And I said, yeah, okay. Let's go further on. Now, you're going to inhabit those columns, right? Because they had to inhabit those columns. And then the next week they come, but I could not believe what I had seen. I literally could not believe. They had taken the profile in floor plan of a column of St. Peter, offsetted it into AutoCAD. You see here the danger of the tools we use, because you could not do that before. You could not just offset a complex line. You had to redraw it. Then therefore you would think twice before you were drawing it, right? No, but there they could draw the line and offset it by 20 bloody centimeters. I could not believe it. And they placed toilets into there, toilets, most beautiful toilets ever. They had the form of a Baroque ornament. Can you believe that? And I said, this is not thinkable. This is a mass. You are carving into a mass. And you are, at the master, you are going to become an architect, you don't even know that. So you're taking one of the great objects of the history of architecture and offsetting this thing. Everything is wrong. Oh, they were a bit embarrassed because they had a great argument, but the drawings were just completely flawless. And that's what I wanted them to do. And another student, he wanted to work on the rotonda, because in architecture, literally, Bluebeard's Castle was the opera, not the Grimm's Tale. As you all know, because you've known, the rotonda is not a place to live. It was never thought it was never thought as a place to live. It's a machine to watch. It's a machine to watch. La Rotonda is a machine to watch. The landscape, it's set there. You perceive the four corners. It's a prison. It's a contemplation prison. And they had taken that as an object. As Bluebeard's Castle, the central rotonda was a kind of an amazing feature where you could actually revolving door, close the thing, and you was closed into one of the rooms, and Bluebeards were actually contemplate different. And they didn't redraw it. I got really from one week to another, I constantly asked them to redraw the thing, not redraw the rotonda. You go take a book, make a copy, and redraw it. Redraw it, you start to understand how it came about. They never did it. They could never really embrace the rotonda as such. And it's a necessary step to do. I remember when I was, don't tell Jacques that, but I'm going to tell you a secret. When I was bored, I had Herzog and Demo. It didn't take place very often, but there are a few moments like we were bored. We would copy cities around the world. Simply just take New York, Barcelona, Madrid, and redraw the floor plans of all cities. Just by simply trying to understand the different substructures of what a city would be. By redrawing them as an abstract feature. And by redrawing cities in an abstract features, you take decisions, you make decisions, you embrace, you leave out things. Therefore, you're already operating something that you are going to be using in your field of architecture, of expertise. That's what we do.
Well, in fact, I'm happy you're mentioning this kind of methodological issues, because I was about to ask you about a more prosaic thing. I think the way you try to make your students think has been very well explained. But for me, what is amazing is the unity and the coherence that goes through all the documents. And I was wondering how you can achieve that without, well, of course, with constraints. Which type of constraints do you put on your students so they can assess this complex thoughts, but produce documents that can be read as done by one hand?
So there are several ways. Let's say on a morphological aspect of it, the layout is given. So we do not ask the students, I don't want any students to waste a second on thinking how he's going to lay out his project. Not a second. I begin the semester and tell them, this is what you're going to hand in, this is the format of the image, and the images are going to be black and white. I don't want to see any colors. That has changed now. We're making movies, it's different. But for portraits, it was black and white. Why was it black and white? And we ended up with lecture. You cannot depict the inner world of a mankind without color. So architecture literally was made in color. But the other three were made in black and white for the very reason, which was actually, this is a beautiful word by Jean-Luc Godin. Jean-Luc Godin was asked once why he had shot one of his movies, Alphaville, in black and white. And he said, I shot it in black and white because the images moan. They are mourning. Something is dead. They have lost something. So that's why portrait series is black and white, because we have lost something. Something has gone lost. Color is gone. There needs to be black and white. So the layout is given. The idea is given, because the idea is the hypothesis. The airport is a prison. That's the idea. We don't ask to, I don't ask the students to come with the idea that the airport is a prison. And it's not even there on the table. It's sustained. So we don't even ask the students. I'm like a lawyer. So I defend a cause. That cause is defended. I'll put it on the table. Now it's your part. But the layout is given. The idea is given. Based on this, they have to build up a narrative with a new idea or a hypothesis and develop a project. Therefore, a lot is given to them, of course. But for me, it's more important that a student does a horrible project, but has had an awareness of what the world is around him during 14 weeks. It's more important the exchange than the result. Therefore, the process is more important than the product. We were very severe with the products because there was a homogeneous rendering and the layout are all the same. And that guarantees also for, let's say, a more massive and more potent discourse within the school also. Because if you ask every student to actually choose the way of representation, you're lost. You're going to lose your energy, you're going to lose his energy, you're going to lose it. This is not the way it happens also in the practice. In the practice, most of it is given also, so why would you have to think about that? I'm fighting against the fetishism of the object. I'm trying to find another way to be a fetishist for something else. You might say, well, I'm a fetishist for the text, perhaps, but not that kind of a fetishist. Of course, I will fight for every detail, and that's what we're doing when we're building. We'll do so. But as a teaching ambition, I have the ambition to promote something else. In other words, I want to open doors. If the students want to enter the rooms behind the doors, it's up to them. It's a shame that they don't, but it's up to them. It's an invitation. Therefore, as I said, texts are to be read, films have to be seen, music has to be heard. We take them to the opera. We invite them. People have never gone to the opera. You know, they were working for architecture literally, or when we did the semester tragedy and comedy, they're 25 years old, they've never set foot in an opera house. I think that's absolutely fantastic for them to have the opportunity to do that within this. And then they all come out and say, so what's the use of this? They always understand later on what's going on. I also understand much later on what I've been doing. There's no point in understanding everything. They always constantly say, yeah, I don't understand. There's no need for understanding. Understanding is something else. And where like everyone else, sometimes you understand, sometimes one doesn't understand. And what's the point of understanding everything? Architecture does not need to be understood at all. You have to realize that 99.99% of the population does not understand anything that lies behind any kind of building, yet they use it, right? Because architecture is to be experienced. That's it. This is it. That's where it stops. The rest is fetishism for architects. Architecture is to be experienced. Not to be understood, just to be experienced. That's it. And once you have fulfilled that, I think you have fulfilled, the task of architecture.
I was going to ask you about this issue of the awareness. As if,
yep.
You've said at the beginning, I think something very interesting in regard to history, as if the way to understand the present has to go through necessarily the questioning of the yeah. past, of the history, in order to unearth the knowledge which is yeah. embedded in history as a way to achieve that awareness. But so that is about content. Mm-hmm. But what about means? I mean, you haven't talked at all about technology. Yep. And I think that it's I would guess that the question Fernando asked you about the narrative, you were going to answer no. I mean, you would reject the idea of the narrative very straightforwardly, because it's more about this. I mean, nothing of this kind of questioning of the past could not be done. The way it's done, it's performed, could not be achieved if it was not through the technology of the digital. If yeah. these images are which it's not about the narrative, it's about the image that goes in and out history yeah. without seams, without yeah. conflict. Yeah. That allows you to put together the boat, the
yes,
sheep,
right.
the mountains, the San Pietro, the yeah. history, the past, the present, here, there. And I think you spoke for 45 minutes without making any reference to technology, which was the means by which, or through which, part of the...
it's a good question. It's... First of all, your question will be probably addressed in a more accurate way, probably as what we're doing today, because we're doing today now in Voluptas, we're dealing with movies, so the montage. I'm interested in not in the collage and the montage. The collage always uses the same kind of thresholds, and the montage is interested into, let's say, creating the illusion of a reality between two foreign realities. So the montage is more interesting, I think, to me than the collage. And I think these images are montages and not collages when they are at their best, let's say. And it's true, it's only possible through technology, but the technology is only a mean for us for now. And what I'm saying is that I always tell the students also that we do not embrace construction, for example. I cannot do in 14 weeks address the issue of economy, science of passionate interest, and at the same time explain to them what a brick is. I can't do that. There's just not enough time. When I entered the ETH, I asked the dean if I could actually have the students for 1 year, which would allow us to actually develop more in detail also what would that be. But no one accepts that. So you have to deal with 14 weeks. And how do you deal with 14 weeks interrupted by classes, by holidays, and so on? How do you deal with those kind of issues? Technology is, of course, at the center of any type of architecture today, let's say. But they say this gymnastic that we're doing with our mind is not being possible by, I'm sorry, but it's only through the web. There's a thing called the book, and the book, contrary to the web, and it has a geography. If you take À la recherche du temps perdu in your hand, this is a book with a weight, with the geography. If I read it onto Kindle, I can flip through the pages, but I have to scroll down. There's no geography. I've lost the geography. This is something that's gone lost. I'm a great fan of technology. I also have my iPhone, and I have no problem. It's a supportive aspect of it. What is interesting about technology, let's say, we used it many times also, is perhaps also its prosthetic side. Therefore, like how within the field of architecture, could architecture become augmented, but not in an augmented reality? That doesn't mean anything. There's nothing else than with the reality we all know. Therefore, again, it's a discourse issue. Rhetorics, I think, is more pervasive and extremely interesting into trying to define what architecture could be or an idea could be more than the technology. But you're right, we're using all the same kind of technology. But I think this is more of a problem, an issue, than a real, let's say, look at what is actually produced today by means of images. You go back in history 80 years ago and everything is different. And you see that Sharon is not developing the same kind of illustrations as Mies is not developing the same kind of images as Le Corbusier, and so on and so on. They all have, for their own necessity and their own sakes, and by the way, Mies is one of the very first ones to actually develop images, because I think his Friedrichstrasse picture that you all know with his plexiglass model and the clay is being used for the old part of the city, has nothing to do with illustration. This is an image. Therefore, it has to be read. And here, we promoted an idea that a floor plan, a section, is just not enough to promote architecture. An image should not be illustrative to what a floor plan is, because therefore you don't need the image. I'm an expert, therefore I don't need the image. Therefore, the image should promote something else. So you say narratives, yes, but narratives for the sake of having one aspect of the project being described, an image for having another aspect of the project being described, and the floor plans and the technical drawings having another aspect. Therefore, to multiply different. And in Voluptas today, we're even go further. We want to draw floor plans which are emotional. Therefore, which do not relate one-to-one to reality. It's not a horizontal section 1 meter above the ground. It will be, if the intensity within the movie of the reality of the perception of the architecture is more intense, then it should be more detailed, should be more drawn differently. Therefore, we're trying to develop floor plans which embrace different realities, different scales, and different realities altogether. And this is going to be done, of course, through technology. It's true.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that it's more about because it's about the images than it's about the technology. What I'm trying to say is that this anecdote about your student offsetting St. Peter's and
that's technology. Yeah. That's only possible because of technology.
My point will be that in order to have this access to history, such a direct access to history, you need the technology of the digital to be able to work with it as if with something given that doesn't have at a certain point doesn't have a meaning or a content, that you can offset it. Because it's just a form or a shape. It's not anymore a history with a content and with a responsibility. So when you say it's just the means, my argument will be, my question will be that it is precisely the means of the digital, the ones that allow you to deal with history in such a way and you can offset it. You can just manipulate it with this
I understand
freedom.
what you mean. I understand what you mean. But it's a question. I could not give a precise answer to that because I think there will be, for example, also examples in history where technology was not there, and for example, the mobilizing of history is still there. I'll give you an example. Well,
it will be like Palladio and classical architecture, offsetting without.
But I take a very precise example. For example, or the resurgence of problematics, for example, without technology. In 16th century, 15th century, I can't remember exactly, the Venus d'Urbino is painted by Raphael, right? 300 years later, comes a guy called Manet, paints it again, it's called Olympia. 300 years later, Same painting, completely different reasons, same painting. I have tears in my eyes when I say this, because this is so moving.
It's an offset.
It's an offset within history. It's an offset. It's a bouncing. There's a sketch by Nietzsche, not just a text, a sketch by Nietzsche where he shows that the problems within history, they're never the same. Différence and répétition. Répétition dans la différence. But the problems, they come back. They bounce. And sometimes they have ways to bounce over 3,000 years. And Nietzsche suggests one thing which is great, which is then again, being recycled because Deleuze made a lot of children in the back of Nietzsche. That's what he does. But he said, what's an idea? Someone comes with an idea, throws it into the air of history. It acquires a speed, a potential, lands somewhere. 10 minutes, a year, a century, 2,000 years later, someone comes across that idea, picks it up, throws it somewhere else. That's what history is made about. I really think that's the way history is built up. And I think it's fascinating. Someone came to me, Bruno Marchand, professor at the EPFL, he came to me one day, he said, François, you have to look at this one. He said, do you know this sketch by Mies? And I said, yes. He said, but it's your house. I said, yes. He said, but did you know about it? I said, no, but it's not the question. I can sell the house with a sketch by Mies. He said, of course it's not the same house, but it's the same section. And it's not I'm happy that I meet Mies. It's for my own vanity. It has nothing to do with that. The joy is an idea has traveled through time, and I picked it up. I did not literally pick it up because I was not aware of that sketch when we did the house. It was brought to me later on. And the fact that these encounters take place, that's what makes history as a dynamic, I think. That's why I think to promote an idea of an absolute architecture without any reference is just either childish or, I don't know what you're going to call it. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. Everything is being brought together in a different manner throughout history by time and necessities. And these necessities are the ones that interest me.
Hi, good afternoon. I don't know, I probably misunderstood you, but you said that architecture is not to understand it, it's just like to experience it.
I said you don't need to understand architecture. It's, I try to understand a little bit of architecture.
Because
I'm just saying you don't need to understand it. Why would you? Do you need to understand Beethoven to listen to Beethoven? No. Don't tell me yes, because if you say yes, then it's over.
Yeah, well, my point was that usually, especially maybe if I'm making a trip with some colleagues, I believe that maybe they enjoy being in a building or actually experiences the way you go around it. But the moment you explain the clues that are maybe the architecture or the development of the building, I think the experience gets better. I don't know if you actually.
I'm not going to contradict you. I'm just going to contradict you on the better, because I don't think it's better. I think it's a different experience. I would say exactly the same thing as Gilles Deleuze promotes with philosophy. There is at least, for anything that is relevant, that's not from me, that's by him, but I think this is really valid to your question. Anything that is relevant in his world is to be read at least two ways. At least two ways. The expertise one, and the non-expertise one. And none of them stands above the other one. And not even any of them can live without the other. They need both. So, it's exactly what you're telling me. What is important is not what you will understand, is what you will experience. That I'm certain. Because understanding, it's a certain ability to also experience something. But if you need to understand a building to appreciate it, then this is the end of the city. Then you don't go to the concert anymore because I don't know how Beethoven... the only thing I know is the fact that when it goes from this to that, something happens within me. And that's the most important part, not to understand how he did it. And I take the example of music because music is fascinating in that aspect because it's devoid of any meaning. It's not like language where it's attached to a certain understanding. Several signs are brought together and then depict something. In music, you don't have that. And there are late works by Beethoven, for example, the Diabelli Variations, some of the last pieces written for piano by Beethoven. And the last variation, there's a change of harmony between the last variation and the previous one. And no one can understand how it takes place. I mean, musicologically speaking, you can't really explain. It's too simple. You would say that the effect that you get from what Beethoven wrote, if you had to explain it by means of musicology, it's not that you can't explain it, it would be very simple, but the understanding will not help you to experience what is taking place. You are being kept outside of it. Of course, it's better to know where Mondrian comes from, because for my own sake, looking at Mondrian's painting without knowing where it comes from, But if you get to know where this comes from, get to know that Mondrian was a great painter also before he became abstract, so where it comes from, how much yellow can come in blue and green and so on, then you start to appreciate it in a different way. That's true. But there's always a double reading, always a double reading. And you know, whenever I'm asked to give a lecture, I'm always very skeptical about showing projects. I do that sometimes. But because for me, there is no challenge in doing that. There's no opportunity for me to reflect on what we've been doing. If I have to sell my projects, you know, I can stand here without preparation. I can give 365 lectures. There's no problem, one after the other. That's not an ambition. If you're serious about giving a lecture, then you have to somehow find a way to question what you've been doing, and at the same time also promote a certain understanding of what you've been doing. But showing just project as such, that's why the project by the students, they're mostly available. There's a book in preparation, by the way, about portraits, therefore we're going to be publishing these projects. I don't need to show all of them. What I want to show you what stands behind it, therefore for you to understand how it came about. Because the objects themselves, I don't need to explain that you enter from here and to go down there. The students will do that better than I do. No? Thank you.
Well, actually, I am very impressed about the similarities within the work.
Well, that's one project. Yeah?
No, about the work of your students and the work of your office you've shown. And I wonder about the relationship between your office and the studio you teach. Mm-hmm. Would you say that your office is an extension of the studio you teach, or vice versa? Because listening to you, I was, well, someone could say that you act like a boss in your studio with this constrained politics, and where you were describing the work you do at your office, you were looking like a teacher. So I was wondering which is this relationship. Thank you.
I'm not a boss, but no. Look, it's an interesting question. If I may, just digress slightly. Yeah. No, I'm not the boss. I'm just a boss. If I am, you know. But the reason for which I say I'm not a boss is that I'm not interested in power. Okay, I'm not interested in power. A lot of my colleagues seem to be interested in power. But I'm interested in something. Not for my own sake, not for my own vanity, but I'm interested in something which is necessary in order to teach something properly. It's called authority. In authority, you can't decrete it. You have to conquer it. Power, you can decrete it. You know since when? You can decrete power since Napoleon. Because Napoleon is the first one to decrete power. He says, I'm an emperor now. He doesn't have anyone behind. You know, he decides that one day he's the emperor. And that's the first time in history. Changes a whole series of paradigms, first time in history, relevant history. Authority, you cannot say I have authority. You have to conquer it. So you have to work politically at conquer it. You have to convince the students that what you do is valuable and so on. And that I find a much more interesting concept, authority, than that of power. And I've shown a project which was developed before Portrait Series was beginning, so therefore also we recycled in a certain way the way of dealing with the images in that respect, but that's not the only thing we do, of course. And I'm not a teacher in the office. I have a great joy in witnessing echoes and resonances within history. I'm never as happy as when an idea in architecture collides with an idea in chemistry or physics or art or anything else. That's why I think, for example, right now I'm currently very much interested in, very much. I'm interested in quantum physics, not because I understand anything. I understand nothing of quantum physics, but there's this guy called Etienne Klein who writes wonderfully about quantum physics. And the great news is that those physicists are just like the architects. If there are no imaginative background, there's no physics. That's it, it's over. The Schrödinger cat is a typical example of a scientist becoming a poet because he needs to have the bloody cat both alive and dead for him to develop his theory. I mean, who can, reasonably consider the cats to be both dead and alive at the same time? But you need to put yourself in that mindset in order to see and foresee what quantum physics is. In Geneva, when they measures the quarks and whatever, the bosons of the Higgs and whatever those guys do, you have to know one thing, is that they're not even measuring the image of the electron. They will never see an electron. No physicist nor chemist has ever seen an electron, and will never see one. So you can forget about the raspberry that you see in your chemistry model. That's not how it looks like. But it doesn't matter. And they're not even witnessing the traces of these electrons. So when you see an image of these, they're not even images of electrons. What they are is it's much more beautiful, and it goes back to my idea of what an image in architecture should be. What they measure and what you see is not the electron, as I said, not even the trace of the electron. You only see the potentiality, the probability of an electron to be there at a time t. So that's great. You don't even measure the electron, nor its trace. You measure just the probability of the electron to be there at a given time. An image like this, if you start to look at it and you say, but what is going on here? I mean, I'm the wrong way, the building is oriented the wrong way, there's a sculpture that I don't know, there's no handrail, there's no architecture, there's a landscape and an infrastructure. If you read it like that, you have gone aside of what architecture is about in this case. But you have to be able to actually engage into a certain mindset and to read the title, which says superstructure. And what's a superstructure? It comes from Latin super, which means above and beyond. And this is above the building and addresses the issues of the beyond. And the beyond in Lausanne is the landscape. That's how I want to, if you do architecture as a designer, not trying to understand what the world is around, you're just a fetishist, and that's great. We need fetishists also to do that. But I think what is more interesting is that architecture being a generalist feature and not a specialist one, although you're still an expert, it allows you to embrace those realities and those complexities, just like no other profession, I would say, today. And because we define the political environment of all our societies, we have a great responsibility in engaging with those questions. It's not about fantasies. Architecture has nothing to do with fantasies, much less with your own fantasies. That's even worse. But the thing is that to be aware that you are defining the political environment is of a great responsibility for the architect, that the architect should remain a generalist and not a specialist is also of great relevance, I think. Because we have too many people, there's a book by Musil called Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Quality, depicts a world that is breaking down its bonds to the point where everyone knows what's a specialist today. And we have a majority of specialists. It's someone who knows everything about nothing. That's a specialist. And that's a problem in our societies because technology, go back to technology is breaking bonds between the people. It's not linking bonds. You don't have 250,000 friends on Facebook. They're not your friends. It's a misuse of language. The cloud is called the cloud for absolute conscious reason. You have to know that the cloud was named because the cloud has no preconceived contour and limits, and therefore is open to dilatation and contraction without anyone contesting the nature of the cloud. Therefore, they named it the cloud. It's up in the air, it doesn't have a form, and it can dissipate, contract, and dilatate at any time. That's why they called it the cloud, for no other reasons. And it's not because it's a nice icon. And they called it the icon on your computer for that very reason too. You know why they called it the icon? And, in the past, the icon, they were religious figures and paintings. But now the icons occupy our desktops. They call them the icons. You have to take the word seriously. When Tim Cook speaks, he weighs the words. I tell you that.
And so we have to take seriously also the sound.
Yeah.
The sound, the siren.
The siren. We have to go. Okay. Thank you very much.